So the idea is that the thing that has to be done is to transform not the macro dimensions that have been focused upon for so long, not to dwell upon the difference between public and private enterprise, or between markets and planning, but rather to focus more on a neglected dimension, the internal organization of an enterprise, to transform it from its capitalist form, a hierarchical, top-down, undemocratic situation in which major shareholders and boards of directors make all the key decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And to propose instead that the workers themselves become the decision makers, that the workers who produce the surplus become identical with those who appropriate and distribute it. And to call this the democratization of the enterprise, not because we like the phrase, we don't, but because it's as American as apple pie, and to reach the audience, we have to go that route, so we do. Democratize the enterprise. And I began running around the United States seeing if there are audiences for this kind of an idea. If there are audiences for the idea that if you don't want jobs to leave the United States, imagine if the enterprise's decision on location were made by all the workers there. Would they relocate to China next week? Not likely. And when it comes to distributing the surplus, would they distribute $200 million a year to the top executives while everybody else can't fund their kids' college education? Not likely. And if a toxic technology has to be adopted because it improves the bottom line, but yet it might infect the children of the workers, man, they wouldn't adopt it, would they? Could I go to the American people, literally, and sell this as a new and different way of understanding what separates the 99% from the 1%, to give a nod to Occupy, which it certainly deserves. Neither Steve nor I had great hopes. We had the confidence to try, which is already a lot, but not great hopes. And I can assure you he was as pleased as I was to watch in a stunning few years, basically from 2009 to the present, the extraordinary interest in the United States for this argument and for the economic analysis that goes along with it. I've crisscrossed the country time and again. Steve Cullenberg was nice enough to mention the radio program I do and have done since March of 2011 in New York City. A radio program whose early sketches, Steve did at least as much work as I did on shaping how this would be set up. The program still airs in New York City, but it now airs on 15 other stations across the United States, including Los Angeles, Tampa, Florida, Houston, Texas, Syracuse, New York, San Francisco, Sacramento, Peoria, Illinois, and Moscow, Idaho. I have no way to explain why those radio stations came to us, but they do. And on that radio program, I talk about a set of ideas that can be summarized as follows. The United States can do better than capitalism. And the response I get to that is the validation, which fortunately happened before Steve died so that he could enjoy a kind of coming of full circle of the politics of the critique of the system, having worked through our reworking of Marxist economics, or rethinking of it, a rethinking now carried on by many of you in this room, in the pages of this journal, in the activities of the ASA organization. a kind of validation that the politics behind it can also be the politics at the front of it. A politics of reopening this country to a debate that became taboo after World War II. For 50 years, you could not debate capitalism. Americans who debated everything else, who like nowadays to debate sex, family, love, schools, medical, insurance, but not capitalism, is finally happening. It is now possible. Last thing about politics and about this. In February of this year, as Cullenberg pointed out, in February of this year, to my surprise, Bill Moyers arranged an interview on his program, which I did in February. I think it's fair to say that there was some apprehension among his folks about how this might go. I can assure you that a year earlier, when I had been, 6 months earlier, when I had been on the Charlie Rose show, the apprehension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Bill Moyers was less of that, but there was still some. The reaction was so overwhelmingly positive to that first program that he did something he very rarely does, which he brought me back the next month. So I was on twice. And over this last summer, when they do selected reruns of the best programs, both of those programs with me were rerun again. I've been on Bill Moyers 4 times this year. And that changes everything. It's a little scary that you become real once you're on television. And you're not real if you're not on television. And it's a little amazing for me to watch and to see how this plays itself out. But for those of you wondering whether being explicitly Marxist, as I am everywhere, if you go to my website, it's all over the place. If you Google me, it's me and Carl all over the place. Being a Marxist is not a problem now in the United States in all kinds of arenas where it once was. I can't possibly fill the invitations to speak that come to me, and they have very little to do with me. They really do have about all this work and all these ideas. That's what's generating them. For those of you who hesitate to become excited about Marx or Marxism or that tradition, maybe because you worry about what the larger society will do. The conditions, the political conditions for being a Marxist are better than they've been here in 75 years. Don't make that mistake. This is an opportunity right now. This capitalist system appears to a majority of Americans to have failed big time. For most of the last 60 years, during all the time that Steve and I worked, leftists around us, and we too, made the claim, we can't get a hearing. We can't affect the way the world works because we're cut off. People don't listen. People won't allow us. We could point to the powers that be that block us from effectivity. We can't do that now. This is the chance, and it probably won't come again too soon. It's the time to recognize that the political project that animated Steve and me at all points, as it evolved, the project of doing better than capitalism, of stopping this absurd habit of thinking that capitalism exhausts a range of options, that capitalism is the frame within which we have to make our decisions. That is not true now. Not in the United States and not in many other parts of the world. The capitalism that grew up in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, that lifted the working classes of those societies up with it, that capitalism has moved on. It's relocating. It's gone to China and to India and to Brazil. and it is teaching the workers of Western Europe, North America, and Japan. It was fun on the ride up. Have a good time on the ride down. Will you permit a capitalism that delivers falling wages and crappy social conditions and cutbacks on everything you assumed? Will you permit that? Will you? That creates an opening. The work Steve and I did was to prepare for that opening. We never knew whether it would come, and we were as surprised as everybody else when it did, but it's here. And as I have told several of you in my closing comment, I'm much busier than I ever was as a professor at the University of Massachusetts. But I'm having the time of my life. I never imagined having the audiences and the impact and the welcome. As Harry and I were driving here on Route 9, coming off I-91, we came to a stop at a red traffic light. And suddenly in the car next to us, little red car, there's a man, I guess he was 35, 40 years old, pounding on his horn and knocking on his, leaning across and knocking on the window. He rolled down his window, and he was friendly looking. He wasn't coming at me with a bat. He rolled down the window, and he leaned across, and I believe these were the words he said, "Are you the anti-capitalist guy?" And I immediately assured him I was. And he gave me a thumbs up, and we continued on to this meeting. Now I understand that was purely coincidental, but it does suggest something is going on, unlike what we've had in the past. This was always a political project for Steve and me, always. Steve, every bit as much as for me. We really do believe that this society has to change fundamentally, and not least of all in the structure of every enterprise that produces goods and services. Because in that space of the workplace, where most adults spend most of their time in their lives, if that isn't the place where non-exploitative democratic processes ought to be located, rather than as now being excluded, then the word democracy has no meaning anyway. And I think that's now an idea whose time has come. So the big question is, how many of you will join Steve and me in running with the ball now that it has tumbled into our hands? Probably for the first time in my life, which means, with the exception of a very few in this room, the lives of everybody else. It's been a long time for me to do this. My biggest regret is that Steve is not here to have that big smile on his face, lean across the podium and say something like, "I told you so." Thank you very much.
We have time for a little bit of Q&A if anyone would like to direct any questions to Rick.
Do you know where Karl Marx is living now?
Where he's living,
Yes.
unless you have a word definition of living, no.
40 miles up the road. Brattleboro.
Brattleboro, because,
Jerry Levy, ring a bell?
no,
He has a one-man show that tours internationally. He's Karl Marx.
he's Karl Marx. That's like we had
Brian Jones.
Yes.
Marx in Soho, we had,
Yep.
yeah,
Brian Jones.
But a more serious question.
please.
Have John Rawls and a Marxist Sen played a role in your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, we struggled with Rawls, we struggled with Sen. Steve had a personal relationship with Amartya Sen. I don't remember where it was that their paths crossed, but Amartya Sen always went out of his way to be explicitly friendly with Steve and with me, but me because of Steve, because he always felt, he made that very clear to us, that as an Indian scholar, the exclusion of Marxists in the West was for him an unappetizing, unjustifiable blot, and that he always wanted to reach out and say that to us. In some of our more sarcastic moments, which Steve and I had occasion to vent, we would have wished he did more than sympathize with us, but we were appreciative that he did sympathize with us. We didn't have a relationship with Rawls.
We're friends, Amartya and I are friends.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in Rawls's concept, especially, which he wrote almost nothing about, but just assumed guaranteed full employment, and he took up J.E. Mead's concept of property owning democracy.
I think Rawls has it, but let me make a general comment that your question stimulates. What is being discovered in the United States, I think slowly now, as part of this same process, is the extraordinary number of leading figures in the United States who over the years have endorsed what you might call Marxism or socialism. It has deep roots in the United States. I can give you just one example that's in my head these days. January 11th, 1944, Franklin Roosevelt delivers his State of the Union message in that year. And he includes in it a remarkable section which later comes to be called, or he actually called it this, an economic Bill of Rights. And he makes the argument there that the actual Bill of Rights is really a political Bill of Rights and has not had the results we would have hoped because it should have been, but hadn't been, accompanied by an economic Bill of Rights. And then he gives a list. Guaranteed full employment, guaranteed housing, guaranteed medical care, guaranteed. It reads like a classic socialist pamphlet might read. And then he makes a very powerful remark. He says, now that the war is coming to an end, they knew in early '44 what the outcome was going to be. This is the plan for what happens after the war. Now, of course, Roosevelt died, and this got pushed out by the enormous reaction of the business community and the wealthy in America, who set about destroying the very coalition that pressed Roosevelt to issue this economic Bill of Rights. I can see from your faces. Let me tell you one more thing. In 1944, Roosevelt also delivered to the Congress a proposal for the new income tax on the rich that he wanted to see passed. His income tax proposal was that the top bracket would be 100%. Anybody who earned over $25,000 a year, that was the number then, be about $350,000 to $400,000 now. Anyone who earned over $25,000 wouldn't earn over $25,000 because 100% of it would be taxed. In other words, this is a proposal for a maximum income in the country, which other countries and other places have proposed. We're not the only ones and we're not the first ones. But the president proposed it. 100% income tax for the richest people. And when he sent it to Congress, the Republicans went ballistic. This is a long tradition for them. And they went ballistic, as you know. And there was a big fight, and they finally reached a compromise. And the compromise was that the top bracket on rich people in 1944 was 94%. Every dollar over $25,000 that you earned in 1944, you could keep 6 cents, and the other 94 cents went to Uncle Sam. Republicans signed off on that one too, right? Now, why do I bring it up? Because on the 18th of October, there is a conference at Columbia University on FDR's Economic Bill of Rights and its applicability to the United States today. People are discovering or rediscovering, whether it's ideas in Rawls or it's Roosevelt, that's part of when a society shifts, when the attitude towards capitalism becomes much more critical, much more open to alternatives of all sorts than it has been in the go-go days that we now know were sustained by absurd levels of debt and all the rest of the last 30 years. Capitalism is in serious trouble, and that's when these things happen.
Yeah.
Hi. Does democratization of the enterprise apply to the political sphere of life? And if not, what is the role of politics or governance in that new way of thinking about how to organize society?
I think the short answer to this enormous question is that the image, at least the image as far as Steve and I worked it out, is of a society that is governed or co-determined, you might say, by an economic democracy in the enterprise and a political democracy in the residential neighborhood. And there are models of this in the history of even capitalist societies. One of the capitalist societies, give you an example, one of the capitalist societies where this kind of thinking went the furthest, led by socialists and Marxists, was in Weimar, Germany. After the collapse of the Kaiser in Germany in World War I, a very radical new society was created by socialists in Germany called the Weimar Republic. And one of the signature arrangements was that they had two houses of parliament as follows. In one house of parliament, you voted for your representative from your residence, from your neighborhood, the way we do. The second house of parliament, you voted from the enterprise. You elected representatives from the workplace. And all decisions had to be co-determined. They had to be agreeable both to the community where you reside and to the community where you work. And the notion that workplace is a community, that's where Marx began. The root of community is the same as the root of communism. It's the community of work. It's the communism of producing and distributing the surpluses that every enterprise is engaged in doing. So the idea is a partnership, if you like, between an economic and a political democracy to realize, and to push it from the other side. The argument is always made, old argument, but one that Marxists have always endorsed. Any effort at political democracy that isn't partnered with economic democracy is predestined to fail, because the inequalities of economics will undo the politics, even if they are formally democratic. And the best example of that is the United States today, where we know who's bought the political system. That's why I enjoy so much reminding people that 3 weeks ago, a billionaire bought the Washington Post and another billionaire bought the Boston Globe. What's that? What is that about? How do we permit the concentration of wealth to literally buy the political, now buy the media? It's very clear you can't have this kind of inequality of economics if you actually have a democratic political system, because then the mass of people will sooner or later figure out that they can use their force in politics to undo the results of a capitalist economic system. And in order to prevent that from happening, those in charge of the economic system have to stymie the political structure. That's the old argument that you have to have the both or you get neither.
Let me tell you firstly that I enjoy your conversation. And secondly, I have this question for you. You were telling us that Gramsci was important for you
Yes.
at the very beginning. And because you are an economist, I would like to know about this kind of relationship. Gramsci and Piero Sraffa, and what is your thinking on it?
Well, Piero Sraffa is one kind of conversation, and Gramsci Gramsci is another. Let me focus on the Gramsci, since I think that would probably be more generally interesting. For us, what made us excited about Gramsci was the argument that comes out of his own life. The life of a, we had an affinity for Gramsci, you might be interested, that was almost personal. Gramsci, I don't know how many of you know, Gramsci's history is he comes from the island of Sardinia, a very poor, especially at that time, 100x years ago, an unspeakably poor peasant, it's an island in the Mediterranean, isolated society. And when Gramsci was born in a very poor peasant family, he was deformed. All his life he had, I don't know how do you, bossu in French? Hunchback, okay.